Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the reading of the fic entitled An Attempt to Fly Under the Radar. Here's the summary. What if Izuku's obvious intelligence and imposter syndrome hadn't gone unnoticed? Or, I took the mistake made in the trigonometry equation Ectoplasm had the class solve in episode 80, and decided to make a whole-ass fanfic out of it. This fic is 14 chapters, with just over 26,000 words. Here's Chapter 1. Chapter 1. A Test. Flying under the radar had never been one of Izuku's specialties. Ever since that day at the doctor's office, the universe seemed hell-bent to thrust him in the spotlight, whether he liked it or not. First, it was Bakugo turning his back on him. Was it ever turned towards him, for being quirkless, bringing his classmates to his side? Then, it was the teachers turning a blind eye to the mistreatment while inflicting their own onto him. After that came the sludge villain attack, which fortunately brought him under the tutelage of All Might. He thought that finally getting a quirk would shut off the perpetual spotlight being shined on him, but if anything, it only seemed to make things worse. He'd maimed his arm on live television during the sports festival. How else was he supposed to use one for all? And helped apprehend a notorious serial killer during his internship, becoming known as that crazy kid who broke his limbs with his quirk. It wasn't as if he had a name or anything. The limelight wouldn't even go away during normal school days. In short succession, he had been both nearly expelled and assaulted during Mr. Aizawa's quirk assessment test, and his assaulter, a certain blonde boy, took their teacher's half-hearted attempt of reprimanding him as a green light to proceed with his ill treatment of him. That day, after collecting their syllabi at the end of the day, Izuku had been cornered outside of the UA gates as he waited for Ida and Uraraka. Bakugo had roughly shoved him against the wall, gripping his tie with one hand while popping explosions near his face with the other. "Since you chose not to fucking listen to me about not applying to UA, you better not try and get ahead of me, Deku," he snarled. "You already fucking cheated your way in here with your bullshit quirk, and you're not gonna fucking cheat with your grades. If you put a toe out of line, I'll fucking kill you like I said I would during that quirk test." And just like he'd been doing for the past 10 years, Izuku listened. Sure, it took him fudging several quizzes and tests, and maybe it included getting several questions wrong during lectures, but he thought he was doing well enough to stay off of Bakugo's radar, at least in that regard. Izuku was ranked 4th overall, while Bakugo sat at 3rd. Of course, that wasn't enough for his acquaintance, but it kept his attention off of Izuku for the moment. That is, until one fateful Wednesday morning, during math class. Looking back on it, Izuku blamed it on the fact that it was 8 in the morning and he still wasn't fully awake from yesterday's training session. The dreary weather outside also wasn't helping any. Normally, the anxiety of just being in class was enough to wake him up better than any caffeinated drink could. Class was an exercise in survival, where the objective was to not give the teachers any reason to pay attention to him. It was a game he was normally unrivaled at, until that fateful first period math class. Mr. Ectoplasm had them evaluate a definite integral written on the blackboard, and that was all well and good except for one thing. There was a typo that wouldn't stop nagging at the green-haired boy. The second bracket shouldn't have had a negative. It should have had a positive. Did Mr. Ectoplasm mean to write the equation like this? Was it an honest mistake? Was this a test for their observation skills? Did he speak up about it? No. He wouldn't dare correct a teacher, especially in front of everyone. Aldera had beaten that lesson into him, sometimes literally. "You think you're smarter than me?" his 7th-grade math teacher had hissed in the middle of lecture, having roughly pulled him out of his seat and shook him like a can of spray paint, his fingers digging painfully into his upper arms. "You think I'm so incapable of teaching that I can't write the correct geometric proof on a blackboard? Why do you have to be such a goddamn problem to the other students?" his 9th-grade teacher had shouted, roughly shoving him to the ground, with a hand yanking on his hair. The hallway was empty, but that didn't mean he avoided landing face first, pain and blood blossoming from his nose. "By seeing that you cheated on this exam, it'll encourage them to do the same. How will they get into good high schools if you keep acting up?" "Midoriya," his 8th-grade science teacher had said in a syrupy sweet, "I'm not mad, just disappointed" voice that he quickly grew to dread more than the yelling. "Do we need to have yet another detention for refusing to pay attention during lecture? Why are you getting such easy questions wrong?" "Midoriya, is everything all right?" Izuku was shaken out of his memories to find his 10th-grade math teacher staring right at him. For that matter, so were his other classmates, aside from Bakugo, who was giving him a glare that screamed, "Don't you dare speak up." Everyone else looked worried. His throat dry, all he could do was hurriedly nod his head, staring down at his blank notebook page, as his face heated up to an impressive fire engine red color. "Midoriya, do you need to visit Recovery Girl?" Mr. Ectoplasm asked, concern lacing his voice. He shook his head, pencil flying across his paper, as he copied the equation down. "No, I'm fine. I'm sorry for interrupting class." "Please buy it. Please buy it. Please leave me alone." "Very well," his teacher said slowly, clearly not believing him. "Does anyone have an answer for this integral?" Izuku did. He not only had the answer, he had the correct problem written in front of him. He wasn't going to say anything about it, though. None of the money in Musutafu General Bank would make him speak up in class. No, he was just going to stay back, keep quiet, and find a way to shut off the perpetual spotlight shining onto him. Chapter 2. Tea, and Something of Notice. Izuku loved his lunches with all might. It wasn't just because of the fact that the symbol of peace spent 1 day a week sharing a homemade bento box with him. He made Izuku homemade lunches, but it was just nice to spend some time with him outside of training. Sometimes they talked about One for All, but other times they talked about anything and everything, from the book series Eternity that he'd gotten the older man into, to how his classes were going. "President Mike was telling me how well you did on your last English exam," the older man said as he held his cup of tea. "You didn't hear this from me, but you were among the only 2 of your classmates to get both his extra credit questions right. Great job, young Midoriya." The praise felt nice. It always would, especially from All Might. And he felt his cheeks redden as he shrugged and took a sip of his own tea. "I've been reading some really interesting books, and one of them actually had the second bonus question in it." "It better not have been Eternity," All Might teased, grinning at his protege. "You know I'm 1 book behind, and if I find out that you went back on our agreement and have been reading ahead—" "No, not at all," the teen frantically promised, waving his hands in front of him, unaware that his mentor was just riling him up. "I've been reading other books, I swear. I've been reading the 3rd volume of a comic book series called Captain Hero, and another book called A Treatise of Human Nature. The second bonus question was from page 43 of A Treatise of Human Nature, and the quote we had to pick the correct translation from was, 'Reason is, and ought only be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office, and to serve and obey them.' If you really think about it, that can be applied to the fundamentals of heroics, because a hero shouldn't only save people because that's what they're factually obligated to do, but rather because it's the right thing to do. It falls into the 4 virtues as well, as justice is the main virtue a hero should have." "Man, no one is better at spouting word vomit than you, kid," All Might cut in with a laugh. "You sure One for All didn't enhance your speaking ability along with your strength?" Friendly ribbing aside, as Izuku sheepishly stopped his ramblings and looked up at his mentor, he noticed an unreadable expression on his face. It was the same one he had after he rescued both him and Bakugo from the sludge villain last April, and the same one as when he offered to train Izuku to receive One for All that same day. It said that he saw something in him, something no one else had bothered to see up until now. Something he wanted to help nurture and develop. "Sorry, I didn't notice I was mumbling again," he mumbled, staring at his lab. "Everyone's gotten on to me about it." All Might shook his head and waved him off. "Don't apologize, my prince of nonsense." He still had that look on his face, and Izuku wasn't sure how he felt about it. "It sounds like it was a really interesting read for you, and it's great to see you so passionate about your studies. Why don't you let me borrow it sometime and we can bounce some ideas off of each other?" Izuku immediately nodded, an excited smile growing on his face as the bell rang, making it falter just a little. Realization that he'd have to go back to class and assume his mission of staying under the radar hit him hard, and he slowly set his teacup on the table and got up, brushing off his pants. Was he stalling? Yes. Would it make him late? Probably. Did he care at the moment? No. He loved these moments with his mentor, and it was up to him to make sure to never take them for granted. "Sure, it's in my backpack, so I'll lend it to you after training today." All Might beamed at him, shooting him a thumbs up as he also stood and led them both to the door. "Sounds like a plan, my boy." 1 day later. Toshinori was stupefied as he sat at the teacher's office and flipped through the book young Midoriya had lent him. A Treatise of Human Nature was an absolute behemoth to read through, 480 pages, with President Mike's bonus question being on page 43 as stated, and it was littered with post-it notes containing annotations and fleeting thoughts digesting the text, annotations and fleeting thoughts that were surprisingly right on the nose. This was easily a university-level piece of literature, and his 15-year-old protege had broken down the text to something he could understand, and applied his own opinions to it, opinions that could easily be tied back to the original work. Clearly, the work had hit home for him, but this was a university-level piece of literature. The green-haired boy was a first-year high schooler who wouldn't even be taking philosophy until university if he chose to attend. Clearly, young Midoriya was smart. After getting to know him, and even after just meeting him, Toshinori figured out his intelligence pretty quickly. His analysis notebooks were proof enough. His point had only been reinforced by his grades once the school year started. 4th out of 20 in a curriculum as advanced as UA's Hero course was nothing to sneeze at. But yesterday during lunch, as he listened to young Midoriya dissecting the book like he had read through it a million times, he hadn't. The spine wasn't worn down enough for that. He got an inkling that maybe his boy was even smarter than he initially believed. But how? "What do you got there, All Might?" The symbol of peace jumped as he turned around to scowl at the sudden intrusion into his personal space. The source, Present Mike, cheekily grinned at him as he sat at his desk across from him, Aizawa following behind. Nearby, he could hear Midnight and Cementos' voices approaching as well. Well, the alone time was fun while it lasted. "Damn it, Mike," Toshinori muttered, closing the book. "Do you really have to scare me like that?" "It keeps you on your toes," the younger man said with a shrug. "And besides, it's not my fault you make it extremely easy and fun for me to want to keep doing it." Trying to fight the fond smile growing on his face, he passed the book over to his colleague. Present Mike could certainly be a lot to handle at times, but Toshinori really liked him both as a colleague and a friend. The man just radiated good vibes and positivity, making it near impossible to stay annoyed at him for too long. "To answer your question, I borrowed the book from young Midoriya," he explained. "We were talking about his latest English exam, and he had some pretty interesting insights about that second bonus question you gave. It came from this book." The younger blonde made grabby hands towards it, eagerly flipping through it when he got his hands on it. He had told the older man that he'd seen the inspiration for his bonus question in the paper, and he hadn't really expected anyone to get it right. He had been pleasantly surprised to see both young Yaoyorozu and young Midoriya get it correct and plainly said as much while they graded papers together. But as his eyes darted across the annotations written down, his usual easygoing grin slowly morphed into expression of awe. He let out a low whistle as he closed the book and handed it back to him. "Well, then," he said, clearly at a loss for words as Toshinori set the book to the side. "Wow. I mean, I had my suspicions about the little listener, but—" "Wait, suspicions?" the older man asked, maybe a tad too overprotective as he narrowed his eyes ever so slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Haven't you noticed, All Might?" Present Mike incredulously responded. "Midoriya's smart, like really smart." Toshinori nodded slowly, not really sure of where the voice hero was going with this. "Yes, I've noticed young Midoriya's intelligence." "No, I mean he's really, really smart," Present Mike insisted, looking a little impatient that he was being so slow on the uptake. "He's like a little curly-haired sponge when it comes to English grammar structure, and you should listen to the way he compares and contrasts it with Japanese grammar structure. Honestly, some of the insights he's told me about are things I saw when studying for the praxis test." "Yeah, the kid's good at English. What's the big deal? Are you just happy to have a student who's actually interested in your class for once?" Aizawa asked, looking and sounding thoroughly unimpressed as he kept his eyes on his computer screen. Ouch. That stung, and that comment wasn't even directed towards Toshinori. He saw the split-second hurt flash across Present Mike's face before he immediately masked it and continued on. Interesting. "The big deal is that if he's this smart, why are his grades where they're at right now?" At both men's confused glances, Present Mike clarified. "I'm not saying that being ranked 4th is bad or anything. It's great, but don't you think he could easily be ranked higher up if it weren't for his grades?" The black-haired man shrugged. "Then he should study more," he bluntly said. "If he's as smart as you guys say he is, then his grades should reflect that. His quirk control should reflect that. His decision-making skills should reflect that." The two blondes exchanged dark looks with one another, both silently deciding to ignore the third man from here on out. Their job was made easier by Midnight and Cementos entering the room, taking their seats at their respective desks after greeting their scruffy colleague. "Are you saying that young Midoriya may deliberately be not performing to his full potential?" Toshinori asked, choosing to rephrase what he just heard in a much friendlier way. Present Mike shrugged. "Yeah, I mean, what else could it be?" he bluntly asked. "I've heard him tutoring his other classmates and things he'll get wrong on assignments, and it's not like he's telling them the wrong thing or anything. He's teaching them the right things, meaning he knows what he's talking about, but he doesn't apply that to his own schoolwork. If he did, his grades would be way higher. And it's not just me either. Did you hear about what happened yesterday in first period math?" The older man frowned and shook his head. The ectoplasm had them doing some trigonometry, and he actually made a typo in the equation he had them solve. He didn't notice it until he was already done writing it out, but he wanted to see if anyone caught it. It looked like Midoriya did, but the kid looked like he was being put in front of a firing squad, like he was terrified of pointing out the typo. What's even weirder is that, when Ectoplasm checked up on him, he saw that he had the correct equation written down. Toshinori frowned deeper. I'll admit that's strange, but you know how shy young Midoriya is, Toshinori countered. I'm not disagreeing with you on what you've seen and heard, but you know the boy avoids the spotlight like his life depends on it. Not when doing heroics, President Mike countered back, leaning forward in his seat. Not when placed in a life-or-death situation. You put him in a practical exercise, and his potential is just bursting out into the open. His deductive reasoning, leadership skills, and strategization is in a class of his own. In the classroom, however, he retreats into his shell. It's almost like he doesn't want anyone finding out his academic potential. The more he listened to his younger colleague, the more the older man couldn't avoid the realization that he was right. He'd always known that young Midoriya was shy, but looking back he saw that something wasn't quite right in regards to his protege's intelligence versus his academic performance. Last year, young Midoriya's grades had been pretty bad, putting him 27th out of 30 students in his class. Seeing both his schoolwork and his natural intelligence and drive, it made something in Toshinori not sit right. But with his boy being hesitant to elaborate on the matter, he let it go. He didn't want to push him into telling him anything that he wasn't ready to divulge. Look, you knew him before UA, right? President Mike asked, not a hint of judgment in his voice. Why don't you try asking him about it? He likes you, he'll listen to you. What about afterwards? We'll talk to the rest of the teachers, and depending on what we see and hear, we get that kiddo an IQ test. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 2 of An Attempt to Fly Under the Radar. Chapter 3 will be up next. I hope you all enjoyed this one so far. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to everything in this fic, and as always, thank you so much for listening.